Okay, it seems like there's been a lot of back and forth. People don't really understand what the process was and what happened.
Right.
What was the version of events when Eric Brown got arrested and then brought into custody and then apparently let out?
So what happened was, and we have all done a deep dive and really have a better understanding of what happened now. UHPD responded to the scene of the sexual assault. As they were canvassing over the course of a number of hours, they came into contact with this suspect, Eric Brown. They were not approaching him because he was a suspect of this sexual assault. He was acting erratically on campus. They approached him. He responded in a very aggressive manner. They tased him, and during the struggle to get him detained, he threw a couple of elbows that struck at least one officer in the hand. That is the set of facts that we were dealing with when UHPD called intake the first time. They relayed that they were investigating a sexual assault. This individual potentially could match the description that we had. But that was all that was discussed on the sexual assault. What they were looking for was what we sometimes call charge holders, placeholders, making sure that we have an individual in custody while we continue an investigation on a more serious crime. The two charges that were accepted were assault of a public servant and resisting arrest. The way that intake works is that we verbally accept the charge, the individual is taken to the Joint Processing Center, and the police officers submit a written version of the facts that they relay over the phone to the police. That lag time in this case, and in most cases, is between 6 and 8 hours. A whole new set of prosecutors were on the intake desk when those documents came across. The documents left out some key elements of the charges that we were filing, which were assault peace officer and resisting arrest. Specifically, there was no mention of pain for the assault peace officer, and that is an element that we have to have in order to accept that charge. And there was no mention as to what he was under arrest for the resisting arrest. There was mention that he was a potential suspect in a sexual assault, but nothing that he was under arrest for. Our DA that was reviewing the written charges decided that she needed to call the officer to get clarification, to ask about pain, to see what, in fact, if anything, the individual was being placed under arrest for. Because of that lag time, which is now almost 10 hours, the officer that had filed the charge was off shift, was in all likelihood asleep. And the only way that we had to get in touch with him was a cell phone. We tried twice to get a hold of him, couldn't get a hold of him. Because our communication internally broke down from the prosecutor who accepted the charges, knowing that we were looking for a sex assault potentially, and the prosecutor who then reviewed them. We didn't communicate that. This prosecutor, the second one, reviewed these charges and basically said, we don't have enough to keep these charges filed, and rejected them, which immediately triggers a release. We have a dedicated 24/7 phone number specifically for the intake of sexual assault cases. Our larger agencies utilize that number and those specially trained prosecutors all the time. When we're dealing with smaller agencies that don't file these cases as often, they're sometimes not aware of that resource. In this case, it went directly to our intake division. Had it gone to our adult sex crimes prosecutors, we would have done what eventually happened, which is the next day, our adult sex crimes prosecutor who was on call realized, he saw the news stories and realized that he hadn't spoken to anyone about this and he would be the only one accepting a charge like that. Mm-hmm. So he reached out to UHPD. And once that happened, we saw what should have happened from the beginning go. The investigation was accelerated. We were able to positively identify this individual as the person who committed the sexual assault and the aggravated robbery, and we filed those cases earlier this week. So as it stands right now, he has a warrant for aggravated sexual assault and a warrant for aggravated robbery. Both of those carry up to life in prison, and we're actively working with law enforcement to apprehend him.
UH has said that the sexual assault was made clear to prosecutors. And I guess it sounds like it was made clear to the initial prosecutor, but not the second prosecutor.
So the charge was never presented because we didn't have enough evidence for a sexual assault charge at the time that they were called. So the conversation with the first prosecutor indicated that yes, potentially down the road this person could be responsible for the sexual assault. But everyone on that call knew that we didn't have enough to file that case at that point. So we filed the other two. That subsequently was not communicated either by UHPD or our first prosecutor to the second prosecutor who's reviewing the charge before we go in front of a magistrate to see if probable cause will be found.
So based on what you guys know about the situation now, what would you kind of chalk it up to about what went wrong?
There are a number of internal and external communications processes that broke down, that aren't really in place. And this is a prime example of what I've been saying for years, in that the intake division inside the DA's office is the most important division out there. Because when mistakes happen, when processes aren't worked through, when training isn't at its best here, terrible things happen. We aren't the resource to law enforcement that we must be in order to ensure that bad guys are taken off the street and innocent people aren't locked up. And so internally we know that we need a better way to communicate from one prosecutor to the next prosecutor in the chain what all's going on that maybe isn't written down. And technology is a blessing and a curse. When I was working a bunch of intakes well over a decade ago, we were all on paper. And so we all had to communicate in that we would walk over to the log manager and say, I'm leaving, but here's one that's coming down the pipe that's going to be pretty significant, even though it may not look that way on paper. We don't have that process set up now. And this case highlighted it to us. And so we're going to work through a better internal communication. Externally, we've got to be able to work with our law enforcement partners to make sure that these kind of breakdowns don't happen again. Because even though the communication hadn't gone from the first prosecutor to the second prosecutor appropriately, that second prosecutor did the right thing, tried to get a hold of the officer. But we've got to have better ways to reach out to specific law enforcement officers that have filed charges. And we've talked with a number of agencies, and we're going to cover all 86 in short order so that something like this doesn't happen.
Since this happened, has there been any direct communication between the DA's office and UHPD about what went wrong?
So yes, we've talked. Obviously, our sex crimes prosecutors have been in close contact with the UHPD working through this. I've spoken to a number of people within the UH system about just communicating and working through this. Every single step of this is staffed by a human being. Mistakes are going to happen. That is unequivocal. What I promise to the public and what I've communicated to everybody at U of H is we're not going to make the same mistake twice. We are going to learn from it. We're going to continue to fix intake. It's a massive lift to fix intake. It's not something that's going to turn around in a day. And so we're working through it, and we're going to get better.
What is the fix, you think, for intake that would fix this particular problem?
Finding a specific way to be able to flag potentially serious cases, even if the actual charge isn't. Being able to communicate between shifts inside there to know that this is coming. And really blasting out, making sure that every agency that we work with has the specific numbers for our specialty prosecutors. I've been a vehicular crimes division chief for years here. Everyone that investigates intoxication manslaughters and fatalities on the roadways knows that we have a dedicated phone number. They don't call intake, they call us. Most of the large agencies know to call the sex crimes specific intake number. we've just got to get better about communicating that there are other resources to law enforcement than our regular intake line.
I don't know if you've seen it, but I sure have. There's been a lot of chatter online since this happened of people saying that, the DA's office dropped the ball. They are blaming judges, but also the DA's office. What's your response to that?
I can promise you this is not a judge's fault.
Right.
There has yet to be a charge to go in front of a judge in this case. That seems to be a lot of people's snap judgment in anything. We made mistakes. Our office made mistakes in this case. It was a breakdown of communication. And because of it, we have a very dangerous person on the streets. And so to shift blame, to not accept your portion of the blame, it wouldn't be honest, and it wouldn't be what I want this office to be in the future, which is when we mess up, we're going to stand in front of the lights and say, we messed up, and we're going to get better from it. So right now, the focus is making sure we get him back into custody with no one else being hurt, and going forward to make sure that we hold him accountable for what we should all really be thinking about is the victimization of this poor woman.
I've been thinking about the victim a lot in this case. I mean, she likely was under the impression that he was in custody.
Right.
According to the records, he stole her mail, so might have some idea of where she lives. I mean, when something so serious is handled like this, what message does that send to rape survivors?
Yeah, I mean, that she's been failed so far. That's the message. And we can't go backwards. We've got to make sure that we get him off the street. We've got to make sure that we get the full measure of justice that she deserves so that no one else can be victimized by this guy.
Now that he is out there, I mean, are there any resources from the DA's office kind of being dedicated to the manhunt, other agencies that you know of that are involved? I don't mean to say manhunt like it's a big search, but what is happening?
It's a big search. Our Gulf Coast Violent Offenders, which is a task force from U.S. Marshals, Houston Police Department, and we've got agencies all over. We're working closely with them. We've got a dedicated investigator from our office who is monitoring and assisting in that. We're doing, our fugitive apprehension unit is keeping up and giving whatever they need, be it search warrants, grand jury subpoenas, whatever technological assist we can do on this. It's a big search, and we are actively looking for him.
Do you think the search has been intensified because of the mistake that happened here, partly?
I would say that if all of the breakdowns that we've talked about hadn't happened, we wouldn't need a search. Anything that you would say, I know you've talked about what the DA's office could do differently next time. Mm-hmm.
What could UHPD or law enforcement agencies do different next time to make sure that something like this doesn't happen?
I've got to focus on making sure that my office is working well. That is something that we'll talk about with the chief of UHPD, and we're going to use this as a training exercise for everyone. So, look, I've never had a perfect case, and I've handled thousands. There are always things that we can do better and be better on. This one is a big, big problem. But because of it, every agency we work with is going to file better charges. We're going to do things better because of this mistake. So we will do a real deep introspective look internally and in the way we cooperate and work with our law enforcement partners. But that's for them to decide specifically what could have happened better on their end.
Anything that you want to add or anything that I missed?
I think you got it.
Okay. Good. Thank you.